It was 4 years ago this month that I was finishing a work shift at a local hospital. And as I was walking out to my car, 2 federal agents approached me and they said that I had a choice. They said that I could do things the easy way or I could do them the hard way. The easy way, as they explained, was that I become an informant for the government. And if I did so, I would never have to see the inside of a courtroom or a prison cell. The hard way is what you see before you. Here I am, having spent the majority of the 4 years since that day in a solitary cell the size of a small closet, in which I'm locked down for 23 hours a day, living with rapists and murderers and home invaders and child molesters. The FBI and these prosecutors worked very hard, and the government spent millions of tax dollars to put me in that cell, to keep me there, to put me on trial, and finally to have me stand here before you today to be sentenced to even more time in the cell. In the weeks leading up to this moment, many people have given me their suggestions as to what it is I should say to you. Some suggested that I should plead for mercy in hopes of a light sentence. Others suggested that I'm going to be hit hard either way. What I want to do for the next couple of minutes is simply to talk about myself. When I refused to become an informant, the government responded by charging me with the crime of supporting the Mujahideen fighting the occupation of Muslim countries around the world, or as they like to call them, the terrorists. But I wasn't born in any Muslim country. I was born and raised right here in America. And it's something that angers many people, that I could be an American and believe the things I believe and say the things that I say and take the positions that I take. But everything that a man is exposed to in his environment is like an ingredient which shapes his outlook and shapes his life in one way or another. And I'm no different. So in more ways than one, it's because of America that I am who I am. When I was 6 years old, I began amassing a collection of comic books. That man implanted a concept in my mind, introduced me to a paradigm as to how the world is set up. That there are oppressors, there are the oppressed, and there are those who step up to defend the oppressed. And that resonated with me so much that throughout the rest of my childhood, I gravitated towards any book I could find that reflected this concept. So my favorites were Uncle Tom's Cabin, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and so forth. And I even found an ethical dimension to The Catcher in the Rye. By the time I got to high school and began taking serious history classes, I started to learn just how real this paradigm was in the world, and still is. So I learned in high school, as a student in the classroom, about the Native Americans and what befell them at the hands of Columbus and the European settlers who came after him. I learned about how the descendants of those European settlers were in turn oppressed under the tyranny of King George III. I read about people like Paul Revere and Tom Paine, and I learned about how Americans began an insurgency against British forces, an insurgency that we now celebrate as the American Revolutionary War. And in fact, as a kid, I went on school field trips to visit the most famous battlefields of that war, some just a few blocks from this courthouse. I learned about Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, John Brown, and the fight against slavery in this country. I learned about Philip Goldman and Eugene Debs and the struggles of the labor unions and the poor and working class. I learned about Anne Frank and the Nazis and how they persecuted minorities and imprisoned dissidents. I learned about Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and the civil rights struggle. I learned about Ho Chi Minh and how the Vietnamese fought for decades to liberate themselves from one invader after another. I learned about Nelson Mandela and the fight against apartheid in South Africa. Everything I learned in those years confirmed that paradigm that I was introduced to when I was 6. That throughout history, there has been a constant struggle between the oppressed and their oppressors. And with every struggle that I learned about, I found myself consistently siding with the oppressed and consistently admiring and respecting those who stepped up to defend them, regardless of nationality, regardless of religion. And I never threw my class notes away. As I stand here speaking, they are piled very neatly in my bedroom closet at home. From these personalities and names and figures in history that I learned about, one stood out for me above the rest. I was impressed by Malcolm X in many ways, but above everything, I was fascinated by the concept of transformation, of his transformation. If you've ever seen the movie X by Spike Lee, it's over 3.5 hours long. And the Malcolm at the beginning of the movie is very different from the Malcolm at the end. At the beginning, he begins his life as an illiterate criminal, but he ends it as a husband, as a father, as an eloquent and protective leader of his people, as a disciplined Muslim performing the Hajj in Mecca, and finally as a martyr. The life of Malcolm X taught me that Islam was not simply something one is born with or inherits. It's not a culture, it's not an ethnicity. It's a way of life. It's a state of mind that anyone can choose, regardless of where they're born, regardless of how they were brought up. And this led me to look deeper into Islam. And I was hooked. I was a teenager back then, but Islam had the answer to the biggest questions that I was asking myself. The questions that the greatest scientific minds had been unable to answer. The questions that the rich and famous were sometimes driven to depression and suicide from being unable to answer. Why do we exist? What's the purpose of life? What's the purpose of our presence in the universe? So Islam had all of these answers prepared for me. Not only that, but it had the answer of exactly how we are supposed to exist. And because there's no hierarchy, because there's no priesthood in Islam, I was able on my own to immediately and directly dig into the Qur'an and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and begin this journey of learning what this was all about, of the implications of Islam for me as a human being, as an individual, on the people around me, on society, and on the world as a whole. And the more I learned, the more I began to value Islam and cherish it like a piece of gold, like my own personal treasure. This was back when I was a teenager, but even today, and despite the pressures of the last few years, I stand here before you and before everyone in this courtroom as a very proud Muslim. With that, I began to look at what was happening to Muslims in different parts of the world. And everywhere I looked, I saw the powers that be trying to destroy what I loved. I learned about what the Soviets had done to the Muslims of Afghanistan. I learned what the Serbs had done to the Muslims of Bosnia. I learned what the Russians were doing to the Muslims of Chechnya. I learned what Israel had done in Lebanon and what it continues to do in Palestine until today with the full backing of the United States. And I learned what America itself was doing to Muslims. I learned about the Persian Gulf War and the depleted uranium bombs that were dropped all over Iraq that killed thousands of people immediately and caused cancer rates to skyrocket around that country. As Jay mentioned, I learned about the American-led sanctions on Iraq that, according to the United Nations itself, resulted in the deaths of over 500,000 children under the age of 5 because they made it illegal for food and medicine and medical equipment to be imported into the country. I saw an interview of Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes where she was directly asked about these 500,000 children who had perished. And her response, she expressed her belief very clearly that these 500,000 children were, quote, worth it. I then watched on September 11, 2001, as a group of people felt so driven and so outraged by the deaths of these children that they hijacked airplanes and flew them into buildings. I then watched as America attacked and invaded Iraq directly in 2003. I saw the effects of shock and awe in the opening days of the invasion. I saw footage of children, of babies in hospital wards with shrapnel from American missiles sticking out of their foreheads. And of course, none of these was shown on CNN. I learned about the town of Haditha, where 24 Muslims, including a 76-year-old man in a wheelchair, women, and even toddlers, were shot up and blown up in their night clothes as they slept by U.S. Marines. I learned about Abida Janadi, a 14-year-old Iraqi girl who was gang raped by 5 American soldiers, who then shot her and her parents in the head and set fire to their corpses. This is a picture of that girl. And as you can see, Muslim women do not even show their hair to unrelated men. And I ask you to just imagine for a moment a 14-year-old girl from a conservative village in the middle of Iraq who has never encountered a foreigner in her life, having her dress torn off of her body and being sexually assaulted by not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 American soldiers. Just imagine that for a second. The government always talks about how angry I am and they're holding it against me as a crime. How can anyone not be angry when they hear a story like this? And even today, as I sit in my jail cell, I read in the papers about the drone attacks that continue to kill Muslims in Pakistan, in Somalia, in Yemen, every other day. Just last month, we heard about the 17 Afghan Muslims, Muslim mothers with their kids, who were shot to death by an American soldier, who then also set fire to their corpses. And these are just snapshots. These are just the stories that make it to the headlines. These are just the tip of the iceberg. But my point is that one of the first concepts that I learned in Islam was the concept of loyalty, the concept of brotherhood. That every Muslim woman in the world is my sister, and every Muslim man in the world is my brother. And together, we are one large body who must protect each other. In other words, there was no way that I could be witnessing these things being done to my brothers and sisters around the world, including by the United States of America, and remain neutral. My sympathy for the oppressed continued, but it now became more personal, as did my admiration for those who stepped up to defend it. I mentioned Paul Revere. When Paul Revere jumped on a horse and took his midnight ride, it was for the purpose of warning the people that the British were going to march to Lexington to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock, and then on to Concord to confiscate the weapons that were stored there by the Minutemen. By the time the British got to Concord, they found the Minutemen waiting for them. Weapons in hand, the Minutemen shot at the British, they engaged them in battle, and they beat them. And from that battle came the American Revolution. There's a word in Arabic which describes what those Minutemen did that day. And that word was mentioned many times in this courtroom: jihad. And this is what my trial was about. This is what all those videos and all those translations and all this childish bickering over, oh look, he translated this paragraph and he edited this sentence and all these exhibits, this is what it all revolved around, this single issue. Muslims defending themselves against American soldiers, doing to them exactly what the British did to America. It was made 100% crystal clear at trial that I never, ever plotted to kill Americans at shopping malls or anywhere else. The government's own witnesses contradicted their accusation. We brought expert after expert and put them up on that stand for hours to dissect my every written word, to clarify my beliefs on that matter. Furthermore, when I was free, the government themselves sent an undercover agent to try to ensnare me in one of their little fake terror plots, and I refused to participate in that. But mysteriously, the jury never heard about that. So this trial was not about my position on Muslims killing American civilians. This trial was about my position on Americans killing Muslim civilians. And that position is very simple, that Muslims should defend themselves from foreign invaders, whether those invaders are Soviets or Americans or Martians. This is not terrorism and it's not extremism. It's the simple logic of self-defense. And it's what the arrows in that seal above your head represent: defense of the homeland. If someone breaks into your home to try to rob you and to try to harm you and your family, logic dictates that you would do whatever it takes to expel that invader from your home. But when that home is a Muslim land and that invader is the U.S. military, for some reason the standards suddenly change, and common sense is renamed terrorism. And those people fighting to defend themselves and their families and their honor become the terrorists. And even though they're defending themselves from people who crossed the ocean to come and kill them, they're accused of killing Americans. The mentality that America itself was victimized by when British soldiers walked these streets 2.5 centuries ago is the same mentality that Muslims are being victimized as American soldiers walk their streets today. And it is the mentality of colonialism. Last month, when those 17 Afghans were killed, I followed the debate in the media. I followed the discussion. And what I noticed was that people were focusing entirely on the soldier, on his life, on his stresses, on his PTSD, on the mortgage on his home, as if he was the victim. Nobody said anything about the people that he actually killed, as if they're not even real, as if they're not people. And unfortunately, this mentality trickles down to everyone in society, whether they realize it or not. Even with my own lawyers, it took 2 years of weekly meetings and discussions and explaining and clarifying and trying to simplify my logic. 2 years before they were finally able to think outside the box and at least ostensibly accept the logic of what I was saying. 2 years. And if it took this long for people so intelligent, whose job it was to defend me, people so dedicated, then to throw me in front of a jury, a randomly selected jury, under the premise that they are my impartial peers. I mean, come on. I wasn't tried before a jury of my peers because with the mentality in America today, I don't have any peers. And counting on this fact, the government prosecuted me, not because they needed to, but simply because they could. One last thing I learned in history class is this. America has historically supported some of the most unjust policies against its minorities, even protecting those policies with the law, only to come decades later and look back and say, what were we thinking? We can look at slavery, we can look at Jim Crow, we can look at the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Each of these policies during their respective times was widely accepted in society. And in fact, each was also defended by the Supreme Court. But as time passed and the world changed, both people and the courts reversed course and looked back and said, what were we thinking? Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist by the government of South Africa and was given a life sentence. But as time passed and the world changed, South Africa shook off its prevalent mentality. They realized just how oppressive their policies were and that it was not he who was the terrorist. They released him from prison and he even became president. So everything is subjective. Even this business of terrorism and who is and isn't a terrorist. One day the Mujahideen fighting an invader are freedom fighters. The next day those same exact Mujahideen fighting a different invader on the same land become terrorists. So it all depends on the time and the place and who the superpower in the world happens to be at the moment. In your eyes, I'm a terrorist. And it's perfectly logical and reasonable and acceptable that I be standing here, the only one in this room, in a bright orange prison jumpsuit. This is perfectly acceptable to you and many people in this country. But history repeats itself. One day America will change, and people will look back and they will recognize this day for what it is. They're going to look back at how hundreds of thousands of Muslims were killed and maimed by the U.S. military in foreign countries, yet somehow I'm the one standing here about to go to prison for conspiring to kill and maim in those same countries, because I support the Mujahideen who are defending those people. The government spent millions of dollars to imprison me as a so-called terrorist, but if we were to bring this girl back to life at the moment that she was being raped by your soldiers and put her on that stand and ask her who she thinks the terrorists are, she sure as hell wouldn't be looking at me. The government repeatedly says that I obsessed over violence and I obsessed over killing Americans. But there is no lie more ironic that I have ever heard.